Welcome to the Confident Retirement Podcast. Is doing the most important things alone a good idea? How comfy are you with your choices when it comes to life's biggest decisions? What is real peace of mind with financial confidence, and how can you get it? Kris Flammang and Mark Picchi are the founders of LPF Advisors in Sarasota, Florida. On the show, they bring together the best and brightest minds to share with you how to have a more confident financial picture. They empower listeners with simple, common sense and financial wisdom. And now, here are your hosts from LPF Advisors.
So I want to welcome everybody to the Confident Retirement Podcast brought to you by LPF Advisors. I'm your host, Kris Flammang, and today I have the distinct honor of bringing Somita Basu to the show. Her firm, Norton Basu LLP, uses their diverse background and perspective to educate their clients, giving practical advice with compassion and world-class service. They specialize in accomplishing clients' legacy goals while taking the mystery out of the estate planning process. Their motto is real people, real world advice, and real results. Somita, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Kris.
Yeah, and we were talking before we came on that we have a common thread that we're both from Nebraska. So most people won't know, but Runza's a big restaurant there. Everyone should try it. But that's a cool connection. So a fellow Nebraskan, this doesn't happen very often. Thanks for being here. But you have a really interesting history of how you came to be where you are now. So I'd like you to take us through kind of your history, where you're from and how you came to be where you are now and how you came to opening up your own firm.
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, my story isn't a straight line. It's not linear. It's kind of spaghetti-esque. I started off, I was a mathematics major in college, and I ended up working in the finance department of Prudential Insurance on the East Coast in New Jersey, and I worked there for a very long time. I eventually moved overseas, and I was overseas. I was in India for 3.5 years as an expat, and then I was in Singapore for an entire decade. And while I was there, I did a lot of consulting work in the insurance industry because that's what I knew. And it was interesting. And I worked for a lot of blue chip firms. I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. I worked for IBM. I worked for HSBC. So I definitely have that corporate background. But after I went to law school, my family moved here to California, and I'm a California barred attorney, right? So that's where I took my bar exam, and that's where I'm licensed to practice. And at that point in time, it was kind of like a do-over for me. I had never lived in California before.
Right.
So it was a very eye-opening experience to be in the Bay Area. And I actually decided to try and figure out how I could get something that was more in line with what I wanted to do. I was doing some legal work in Singapore, but it was very transactional corporate work, which didn't really interest me. So I decided to volunteer. So I volunteered at a legal aid organization called Bay Area Legal Aid. And I volunteered there 3 days a week, 9 to 5, working on cases for tenants who are being, unjustly evicted, which is a huge problem in this country and especially so in the Bay Area. And that's where I met my partner, my law partner. We joined that legal clinic on the same day. We were in training together. They put us in the same department. We worked on cases together. And I saw how she worked. And everything, I guess it's all the rest is history, as they say. So that's how I came to practice in estate planning in California.
So you say on your website that you and your business partner have a common sense of humor.
Yes.
So do you care to elaborate on that? I don't know what that means.
I would say it's very dark. I think a lot of attorneys have a very dark sense of humor. And because we work in estate planning, it's very dark, I would say, so, but it's what keeps us sane.
Right.
And I'm sure if somebody were to overhear us, they would say that's really, morbid. Right. But I think one thing that we are confronted with all the time is that death is a part of life. It's going to happen to everybody, just like taxes. It's very true. I think not confronting that fact head on causes a lot of problems for the people you leave behind.
Yeah, because you just avoid it, right? You know you're going to die. It's just not going to happen today.
Right.
Yeah.
Most
so
likely.
Just put it off. right?
Yeah, that's
like
right.
we all know when we're going to die or something, right? Yeah.
Right.
So is there something that you wish that you knew when you started out that you know now? If you could go back and tell your younger self, or give your younger self advice, what do you think that might be?
Two things. I think one would be don't undervalue yourself. And I think that's something that's very hard sometimes when you're an entrepreneur, because more than attorneys, I think, Zakiya, my partner, and I, we consider ourselves entrepreneurs. So, value yourself correctly, the right way, and stick by that. And the other thing is, I don't think I would have realized how much perseverance it takes to get to this point. So you really got to stick in there. There's a lot of highs, but there's also lows, and you just have to stick through all of them to make it.
Yeah, it's that burning the bridge and saying, I got to make this work. I have no backup plan. I just have to make it work.
Yeah.
I think anybody who owns a business or runs a business, that's a pretty necessary trait to develop or to have.
Yeah.
So what's a simple way that you would explain to a potential client or to an existing one why it's important that they have a comprehensive estate or an asset protection plan?
So what we tell our clients is that you don't do an estate plan necessarily for yourself. You do it for the people that are left behind. And so, if you love your kids or your friends, or there's a charity that, that's close to your heart, you want to make sure that they're taken care of, because, when you're gone, right? You've left behind, whatever. It doesn't matter to you, but it will matter to the people you leave behind. The other thing that's important to know is that an estate plan is just not about what happens when you die. It's about what happens if you don't die. With people living longer, with dementia, Alzheimer's, COVID, you just never know when you may be incapacitated or unable to do the things you need to do to take care of your assets or your finances or your family. So you need somebody to be able to step in and do that. Having to go to court to do that is not the right option for anybody at any time. You always want to have something in place that avoids the legal process whenever you can, the court process. And so that's the other part of estate planning that people don't necessarily think about. Yeah.
And I was curious, I was talking to somebody from Georgia today. Do you know, has the probate court process got even more backed up because of COVID?
Yes. So I'm guessing this is a problem all over the country. It's a big problem in California, compounded by major budget cuts. So the court was already under a crunch. It's now even under a bigger crunch, and probate tends to be like the orphan, the stepchild of the court system. So even though that's where a lot of people interact with the court system, but we've just seen cutbacks in clerks' offices, in the attorneys working with the court. Santa Clara County, where I live, has, I think, the second largest number of probates in the state of California. Wow. And until this year, we had one judge.
Wow. Okay. That puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
So are there some core practice areas in your practice? Are there some core areas where you get the most enjoyment? So I noticed like on your website, there's lots of practice areas that you guys have.
Yes.
You have a certain area that you really either get excited about or that you really enjoy.
Yeah, so I think it's something slightly different for each of those practice areas, because I enjoy all of them. But for me, I think the ones that I enjoy the most are the litigation cases. Unlike a lot of estate planning attorneys, we do litigation as well, which is what really informs the way we advise our clients. We see when things go wrong. And in the litigation cases, we really get to help correct a wrong. Somebody's done something they shouldn't have done, or somebody's being accused of doing something that they didn't do, and we really get to help right that wrong. And I really like that part of it.
Okay. Well, and I don't know if you find this to be true, but nothing causes more arguments or arguments easier than a lot of money being left between some people, and there wasn't a good job of estate planning done, and now everyone's coming out of the woodwork and there's a lot of fighting.
Yeah, right? Exactly. When there's money,
it can be avoidable if they've done the planning.
Exactly. And also not addressing the fact that there are bad relationships or strained relationships and assuming that they'll work it out. So that's definitely a big cause of problems. Yeah.
Okay, so I was hoping you could give us an easy way to understand or an easy way to explain a revocable living trust. So what it does and how it works.
Okay. So a revocable living trust is actually the vehicle that's probably most appropriate for most people with assets. And so if you have anything in the state of California, anything over $166,000 worth of assets in your name, will alone will not avoid probate. So the will, whether you have a will or you don't have a will, you will be in probate. The only way to avoid that is to set up a revocable living trust. And a revocable living trust is very easy to understand if you think about it as like a gift box. So it's like an open box. During your lifetime, you put all your assets in there. It's a separate entity. It's a box. It's different from you. You're putting all your assets in there. And when you pass away, the top of the box goes on. Nothing else can be put in there. The bottom opens and it goes out to whoever you say. So that's the best way to think of a revocable living trust.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, no, that's a great way to think of it. I like that. So is there something that you're really liking best about your business right now? So not a practice area, but like running a business, owning a business. Is there something that you really are liking about it right now?
I really like the marketing part of it, the business development part of it, which is very unusual because most lawyers hate doing that. I actually like networking. I like meeting new people. I like getting our message out there. We do a lot of speaking and explaining legal concepts in an easy to understand way is kind of what we do. We want to make it accessible to everybody.
And I think, your analogy about the open box and the top of the bottom of the box, if you can somehow create some kind of a picture or an analogy for something, that I am often finding myself thinking of ways, how can I explain this in a way where they can either visualize it or understand it so then they can make a decision? Because you have all this jargon and all these words in every industry or you're over people's head. And that's a true skill. A lot of people don't have that. And they just assume that people understand what they're saying, even though they have a glazed look on their face when you're talking. Okay, so what do you think a common misconception that people have about attorneys or just estate attorneys? Like, what's a common misconception?
I think a lot of people, there's two. I think one, everybody thinks that, estate planning is ridiculously expensive. Like, I can't afford it. But I promise you, probate is a lot more expensive.
Right.
And we know that. So because we do probate as well. So we know exactly how expensive it is. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think people think, well, I can get the attorney to write whatever. I mean, I'm going to tell them what I want and they're going to do it. And while a lot of things may be legally possible, they are not always advisable. And so that's one of the things that we tell our clients.
So I think of the difference between having knowledge and wisdom, right? So you can know stuff, you can have the knowledge. Yeah, we could do that, but it's not advisable because it's not going to work, or it doesn't make sense in your situation or in anybody's situation. Yeah. Okay. So do you think people have that misconception that just estate planning isn't necessary for them? It's like, I don't need it.
Yes.
And why do you think they have that?
I think because of the word estate, I really think that's part of the problem. People are like, I don't have an estate. I'm like, well, do you own assets? Because then you have an estate. People hear the word estate and they think like a mansion, and all the accoutrement that comes with that. And that's not what an estate is. An estate is everything that you own, whether it's worth $100 or whether it's worth, $100 million. That's your estate. Anything that's in your name as an individual, that's what you own. And so I think that throws people off. People always hear that word and think of a mansion and multi-million dollars.
So what word should we be using? What do you think? What's the word we should be using instead of estate?
That's a good question. I would almost like to call it asset planning, but then asset is another word that a lot of people
I don't have any assets or that means
exactly. So I think it's kind of up for debate. There's a lot of things you could call it, if you call it death planning, people are going to be really taken aback, right? So
maybe that's you and I's homework. We could create a word together. We'd have to copyright it.
Yes.
We could try to monetize it. It would be our word. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
It says you can use it, but you have to pay us royalties
That's
for using
right.
it.
That's right.
All right. Are there some commonly overlooked areas or blind spots when it comes to clients? So sometimes a client might come in and say, yeah, I need a will, and I heard about this revocable trust, and I want to do that. And then they are these blind spots, things that I don't see or they're not aware of that also need addressed, but they just don't see them. So there's some common ones that you see in working with people?
Yeah, there's a couple. So the first one is relationships, which I've mentioned before. So people always tell us, well, my kids get along great, so there's not going to be any problem. And I'm like, well, what about when your kids get married?
Yeah.
You know, that's what happens. The spouses are like, you should tell your brother or your sister to do whatever, right? And so that's something. So leaving things too fluid or vague can cause a problem as your kids get older and get married. The other thing that we find is usually a really big problem is the way people don't really look at their 401ks and their IRA accounts. Now, those shouldn't be in your trust, but you need to make sure that the beneficiary designations are updated. And you need to make sure that if you only have one person designated and they predecease you, now that 401k account is in probate. There's nothing else I can do. So people need to update those regularly.
Yeah. And do you see circumstances sometimes where naming a trust as like a contingent or a tertiary beneficiary might make sense?
Almost never. If you have a trust that is specifically created to be an IRA trust, and in that case, then yes, most people don't know to ask for that.
Right.
And there are a lot of attorneys who don't draft those types of trusts. If the trust becomes the beneficiary of the IRA and it doesn't have the appropriate IRS required language, you're going to get taxed at the trust rate, which is like 39%. So
on the whole thing. Right.
Yeah. It's not good news.
Yeah. Okay. So that leads me into try to think of a recent client experience, very satisfying for you, for them. What problems were they facing? What were they trying to accomplish? How are you able to help and improve their life?
Yeah. So on the estate planning side, we actually had a surviving spouse. And this is something that we get a lot of lately as the surviving spouse comes to us and says, my husband and I did this trust 30 years ago, in the 90s. And my husband passed away 5 years ago. And my kids are like, you need to look at your documents. And so they come to us and they really just have no idea what the trust does, how it functions. And they're very confused. They don't, sometimes the assets aren't appropriately titled. And so what we did was, we actually sat down with her and explained like, okay, this is what your current trust is doing. This is what it says. If something were to happen to you today, this is what would happen. And they're usually very taken aback because that's not
their wishes. Right. Yeah.
So we restated the trust. We got the assets into the trust. And it's a very common occurrence, but it's very gratifying because we're able to explain the process. They weren't necessarily, the husband dealt with the attorney, and it was somebody who only spoke with the husband and didn't really address the wife. So we do a lot of that type of thing. And we've had a couple cases like that recently that were very gratifying.
Cool. So educating them and then bringing those aha moments and then understanding what their wishes are and then implementing that. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I want to shift gears just a little bit. And I want to ask you, can you think of a first memory or experience that you had with money? Could be as a kid, could be a teenager, could be when you were in college.
Well, I remember very clearly during childhood that money was not a thing that was discussed in my house. So,
okay. All right. So elaborate on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of minority cultures, immigrant cultures where money is just taboo. You don't talk about it. And you definitely don't talk about it with your children. Right. And so I didn't get a lot of financial education from my parents. That just wasn't the culture. So I had my first aha moment when I started working when I was, I think 17 or 18 at like a Barnes and Noble. Great job. I loved it. I love to read. So I loved my job. But I remember getting my first paycheck and thinking, where did it go? Like, where is what happened? And so that was a rude awakening. And that's one of my first memories of getting a paycheck and thinking to myself, what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, you have taxes and then you probably had all the coffee drinks that were deducted, right?
I'm pretty old, Kris, so this was before there were any cafes and Barnes and Noble.
Food stuff. There wasn't any in Barnes and Noble. It was just the bookstore, huh?
It was just
a
bookstore.
Wow. Okay.
That's how old I am. That's when bookstores were just bookstores.
Well, you don't show it. So are there any experiences that you can think of either personally or in your business and working with people that have made you really, really aware of the positive or the negative impact of wealth, right? Because money itself is not really a negative or a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
How it's used or how it's, used by people or families, that can make it a positive or negative experience. So anything personally or through business that you can think of where it made you aware?
Yeah. So one thing I've realized, and it takes a while to learn this, but money is just a tool. As you said, it's neither good nor bad. It just depends on how it's used. However, in business, one of the things I have seen is that when wealth is being passed on to a generation that hasn't worked to acquire it, the appreciation for that is very little. So people don't appreciate what they don't work for, and they tend to be very greedy about it. They seem to have a sense of entitlement to it, and they seem to feel like it's owed to them, which they don't have. That attitude doesn't necessarily carry into their own families, like their nuclear families' sense of money and wealth. Yeah,
I think I've read before that in closely held family businesses, if those are passed on to other family members and children, I think by either the second or third generation, 90% of those businesses are out of business.
Yeah.
Speaking to what you're saying there, where they didn't have the same either passion or dedication for it, having to work with it. And I bet you probably can implement some of those conversations in with people when you're talking about that, when they're talking about structuring how they want to leave the money to their kids or their grandkids. They have to have some level of maturity or something before they start to get some of that money. Okay. So what would you say is your biggest life accomplishment so far, either personally or professionally, or both?
Right. Probably going to law school remotely and flying into California to take exams with a 12-hour time difference from Singapore. I think that's probably my biggest accomplishment. I mean, that was just pure grit getting that done.
Yeah. Adrenaline.
Passing the bar on the first time, and just literally jumping off the cliff with Zakiya and starting this firm. We just, neither one of us have lawyers in our family. We are the only attorneys in our family. Nobody's ever gone to law school. We don't have a lot of entrepreneurs in either of our families. So kind of had to figure it out ourselves. So getting this firm to this point is probably one of my biggest accomplishments.
Awesome. Yeah. Scary and exciting at the same time. And so you said there, it leads me to, so both of you, nobody, not having any legal background in either of your families. Did this happen when you're at family get-togethers and you're sitting with someone and then people start asking you legal questions? And you're calling for legal advice? Does that occur? It
does. I think it happens to her.
You? Okay.
It happens to her more frequently. I do get some questions from like my cousins and things like that. Whereas, my parents will be like, we really should talk to somebody who's a lawyer. And I'm like, I'm sitting right here. Right.
They still see you as the little girl, right?
Yes.
They see it, right.
Yes. They don't see me as a grown adult functioning, human. My mom still sees me as if I'm 16. Right. So I think it's just a little bit different. I know Zakiya gets a lot of questions from her family.
Okay. Yeah. If you weren't doing what you're doing now, what do you think you'd be doing instead? Was there something growing up that you thought, I'll be this, or I want to be that?
Yeah. You know what I wanted to be is this is so out of left field, but I wanted to be the person during the football games who does the statistics that they put up on the screen. Yeah. That's what I wanted to do because I was football obsessed because, of course, I grew up in Nebraska. I used to not eat when the Huskers lost, by the way. My mom was very flummoxed with she had no idea what to do with me. She had like an 8-year-old who would just go into a depression when the football team lost.
The whole state goes into depression.
Yeah. Right? And she didn't even really know what football was, right? Because she grew up in a different country. So it was very difficult for her to understand. I was obsessed with Husker football. So I wanted to be that person. So I figured that would combine sports and math, which were two things that I liked. And that would have been my ideal job.
All right. Well, maybe your second career after this one. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Post Social Security, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So is there a unique or interesting fact about you that very few people know?
A unique and interesting fact about me that very few people know. I guess one of the things that people don't know about me is I have a very high appetite for risk. So I've actually jumped out of a plane and I've jumped off a bridge. So I've done both of those things, which seems very...
Was the bridge jump, was that using a parachute or was it a bungee thing?
It was a bungee.
Okay. Both equally scary, but I was just curious.
Yeah. It was a bungee off a bridge over a river and in New Zealand. And that's also where I did the skydiving. And so it's very not in line with my culture and my upbringing, but yeah, I did it. Yeah.
Right? Or we don't do that stuff. Now, you can go on record now saying that you had all of your proper estate documents in order prior to the jumping. Is that true?
Yes, I'll say that I did.
Of course. Okay. Yes. Of course. Yes, you did. Okay. All right. So how do you stay, like stuff changes all the time. They're talking about the estate tax exemption might go down. They're proposing that could come down a considerable amount. So how do you kind of stay on the cutting edge of your industry? Is there something you follow or read regularly, or how do you stay on top of things?
Yeah, so I'm a member of a number of associations. So the American Bar Association, the California Lawyers Association, and we follow the trust and estate sections. And we're constantly reading and attending lectures and educational things. Obviously, the estate tax exemption is something we always keep a close eye on. We have a lot of clients who say, well, it might come down in the future, so what should I do now? And I like to say, unless you're at a really high amount of assets, and by high, I mean 20 million or 25, right? And above. Unless you're at that level, it doesn't make sense for you to take assets that you might need to, use or liquidate and put them beyond your reach into something that's irrevocable to try and get around the estate tax exemption. We, like I said, we're very practical, but the other thing is, I tell clients all the time, I cannot plan for something that hasn't happened yet. Like I don't know what the estate tax exemption is going to be. So I can't advise you now. I have to draft your estate plan now for the amount that it is right now. Yeah. And for a lot of the middle class, upper middle class type of families that we serve, that's good enough. That will work for them. We do not want to do anything overly complicated if you don't need it.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think about, people are always asking me, well, not so much anymore, but, what's your market outlook for the next 6 months, which that's just anyone's guess, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They could throw a dart at a dartboard and get a good enough answer. So my answer to that is always I have no idea. So which they go, well, what do you mean you have no idea? I'm like, well, that's not what you have me for, is to make guesses about what's going to happen in the next 6 months. So we got to plan for what you have now and what you want to do in the future. That's what we need to focus on. It's fun to talk about that other stuff hypothetically, but we're not going to make any plans based on that.
Right.
Okay. So what do you consider, now I asked you about your practice areas that you really like. What do you consider to be the most exciting part of your business right now? So what are you most excited about with the business?
I think the thing that's the most exciting part about the business is the proliferation of technology and the way it's being used, not just by attorneys, but by courts. Yeah. So all of my hearings have been remote. There are a lot of tools available to attorneys who want to use them. Yeah. I think the problem is that the old guard is very slow to change. The law profession in general, the legal profession is, I would say, about 15 to 20 years behind any other type of profession when it comes to adopting technology. Yeah. But I think the tools are out there. We use a lot of them. We're always looking for ways to streamline our practice. So, the whole pandemic situation.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, it didn't affect us as much in terms of our day-to-day lives, other than we just weren't going into the office. But the tools that we used were exactly the same.
Yeah. So do you think the pandemic sped up you said the profession's about 10 to 15 years behind. Do you think the pandemic and having to do things digitally, having to do them virtual, do you think it sped up their catch up on that? Or do you think that those things weren't widely adopted across the profession?
I mean, I think it did speed it up because I know a lot of court required, for all sorts of cases, remote hearings, except for criminal, where you still have to do it in person, right? And that's a whole separate kettle of fish. But
Yeah.
in terms of on the civil side, I think it did speed it up. I think a lot of courts started requiring e-filing and notice going out electronically and, let everybody know it's going to be a Zoom hearing. So that was kind of where I think it kind of sped up some of that development and progression. There are always going to be attorneys who want to do things the old school way. And I understand that. I understand that that's just the way it's always been done, and they're comfortable doing that and they're uncomfortable with technology. But I think the younger batch of attorneys that's coming up is going to be used to, that kind of thing, more technology, more remote appearances.
Yeah.
And that also means I think that's better for the client. It doesn't take me 3 hours for a hearing anymore. The hearing is just however long the hearing is. So if it's 30 minutes, it's 30 minutes. I don't have to travel, wait, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, we've seen that in our industry where people were reluctant before clients to maybe do something virtually. Now they didn't have a choice, so they had to adopt it. And then most of the time at the end, they say, oh, that wasn't that bad. Like, well, I've been telling you that for 5 years, right? But I'm glad that you figured it out on your own, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. So on the flip side of that question then is, what do you think is the biggest challenge in your business right now? So not the clients you serve, but like you and your partner, what's your biggest challenge you think, going forward?
The biggest challenge is always finding good people. Finding people who you can trust, who will deliver, provide a work product that is up to our standards. We have very high standards. And so finding people who can deliver that is very difficult.
Okay. Now, do you mean in your area or in the state, or just you think in general in your profession?
Yeah, I think just finding support staff. I mean, at this point, we're okay with anybody anywhere in the state because almost everything can be done virtually, right? So we're based in the Bay Area. We have a really good paralegal who's based in Southern California, right? So if they're in California, that's fine. So location is not a problem. But, what we've found is after interviews, receiving 150 resumes, there was literally maybe 2 people that were appropriate for the role that we were trying to fill. So it's difficult to find people.
It is needle in the haystack then, almost.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I'm also, along those same lines, I'm also curious, you probably have either felt or encountered some level of commoditization in your industry. So how has that kind of affected your practice, and are you guys aware of that, and how are you kind of addressing that?
Yeah, so we're hyper aware of that because estate planning is the one thing that, every financial advisor on TV has a will and trust kit, and there are websites where you can do your own, That's not what we do. We are not document generators. If you want somebody to generate you a document, you should find a different firm. That's not the business that we're in. We're in the business of providing advice. The documents happen to be generated for you, yes, but the value that we bring is our experience in all parts of estate planning and probate, not just generating estate plans, right? We do trust administration, we do litigation, and we do probate. So that informs how we advise our clients. We also remain available to our clients even after they're done, right? So we're a resource for them, and clients call us 9 months, 2 years, 5 years later with a question or a referral. So they stay in touch with us, and that's the level of service that we provide. So we're not in the business of competing with any do-it-yourself type of things. However, having said that, that is an appropriate place to go for people who are renting. All they have is a car and maybe a bank account, and that bank account doesn't have a lot in it. That might be a good option for those people.
Right. And that serves a purpose. And I think that comes back to something you said earlier, which the internet, there's plenty of information, there's plenty of knowledge on the internet, info, facts. How does it apply to you? How do you implement it? Should you apply it? What does it mean? How's it going to work? That's the wisdom part and you can't really gain wisdom. You can't go on the internet and get the wisdom. That comes from somebody that has life experiences. Okay, great. So do you think there's a question that I should have asked you, or would you like to expand on anything that you said earlier?
Actually, I would just like to say that I think estate planning is really just a fundamental part of your financial life. People don't think of it as part of your financial life, but it is one of the building blocks of, your finances and your financial health. So people think about the rate of return on their investment account, but they don't think about what will happen to this account if something happens to me, if I'm no longer here. What happens to that account? And that's a very important part of it, right? So that's your legacy. That's what you're passing on. And you don't just want to pass it on. You want to pass it on along with your values. And there's a way that can be done, right? It's not just about splitting your account between your kids. It's giving each kid a portion of the account, but in a way that's appropriate for that kid or that friend or that charity, right? So some thought has to go into these things. And while it's not necessarily a fun thing for people to do, it is a really necessary thing. So I think people don't think of estate planning as part of their financial health, and they really should.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so something else just popped into my head. Since we have a pretty good rapport going, I want to ask you this question. What do you really care about outside of your business? So outside of work, what are you really passionate about? What do you really care about? What's important to you?
I think what's really important to me is just the concept of fairness and justice. It's just very important to me. I serve on the board of a legal nonprofit here in the Bay Area, and they provide legal services to victims of human trafficking. Because, what I didn't know was that victims of human trafficking are often charged with crimes, even though they're victims themselves. This nonprofit helps those victims, who are largely women, often women of color, immigrants, minorities. So I think justice and fairness is really important to me. It's something I'm very passionate about, which is why I devote time to those types of efforts. Beyond that, I'm just like everybody else. I'm binging on Netflix, wishing things would open, and, yelling at my kids. So other than that, everything is...
living life. All that stuff.
Right. Yeah. Living my best life.
And for people who are watching that are in California, what is the name of that nonprofit?
It's called Justice at Last.
Okay.
And it's the only one of its kind in the Bay Area.
Okay, great. Okay, just in case they wanted to find out more about that. And if people want to learn more about you or your firm, what is the best way for them to contact you?
So the best way to learn more about us is go to our website, www.nortonbasu.com. It has a lot of information about estate planning, probate, trust administration. If you need information, if you want to learn some basic concepts, our site is a great place to start. It has all of our contact information, and it has detailed biographies. So if you want to know who we are and what we do, that's the best place to start.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Well, Somita, listen, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And folks, we've been here with Somita Basu from Norton Basu LLP. And thank you all for tuning in to the Confident Retirement Podcast, brought to you by LPF Advisors, where we're raising the retirement confidence of people every day to another level, one show at a time. Thanks for staying with us, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Confident Retirement Podcast with Kris and Mark from LPF Advisors. For more information on them and retiring confidently, please visit lpfadvisors.com. If your ears are pleased and your mind is now at ease, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.